It was the winter of 1941, a world engulfed in smoke, steel, and sorrow. Europe was burning, the Pacific thundered with explosions, and the skies above were the new battleground of the modern age. Fighter planes, once symbols of daring innovation, now decided the fate of nations. Britain's Spitfires, Germany's Messerschmitts, Japan's Zeros, each a legend of its sky. Yet among these titans of the air, there existed a machine so tragic, so hopelessly outmatched, that it became the very definition of failure. Its story began not with arrogance, but with desperation. As factories worked day and night to feed the war machine, one aircraft was rushed from blueprint to battlefield in record time. The engineers promised hope, but what took off instead was humiliation. Pilots dreaded being assigned to it. Enemies mocked it before it even reached the front lines. And when it finally met combat, it met disaster. This wasn't just a bad plane, it was a mechanical tragedy. Slow when it should have been fast, fragile when it needed to be strong, and cursed by design flaws that doomed every mission. In a war where survival depended on every ounce of performance, this fighter became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when politics, pressure, and pride override reason. Today, we uncover that story, the forgotten and heartbreaking tale of the most pathetic fighter of World War II. It began with confidence, or perhaps, delusion. The year was 1939, and the world stood on the edge of total war. In secret workshops and echoing hangars, the hum of ambition filled the air. Governments everywhere were desperate for an edge, a machine that could dominate the skies, a symbol of national pride and technological prowess. Engineers, under immense political and military pressure, promised that they could deliver it. They spoke of revolutionary designs, unmatched maneuverability, and speeds that would humble any enemy. On the drafting tables, the lines were elegant and promising. To the generals, the blueprints looked like victory itself. But dreams drawn on paper rarely survive the test of wind, fire, and war. The fighter's story began as a desperate response to growing threats. Rival nations had unveiled new, deadly aircraft, faster, deadlier, and crafted by masters of aerodynamics. The pressure to keep up was unbearable. Ministers demanded a quick solution, a patriotic miracle that would not only protect their skies but prove their nation's superiority. There was no time for second thoughts, no room for caution. The order was clear: build it, fast. What followed was an unholy marriage of ambition and haste. The aircraft's designers, brilliant yet cornered, took shortcuts they never would have dared in peacetime. Rivets were chosen for speed of assembly, not safety. Materials were substituted due to shortages. Engines were borrowed, modified, or simply pushed beyond their limits. It wasn't engineering, it was improvisation under fire. The first prototype looked sleek, almost beautiful in its simplicity. The press was invited to see it. The newspapers called it the dawn of a new air age. Politicians smiled proudly, photographers captured the gleam of polished metal, and the engineers forced smiles that hid their unease. They knew what the generals didn't: the plane wasn't ready. During taxi tests, it shuddered like a frightened animal. Its wings flexed unnaturally under even mild strain. The controls were sluggish and unpredictable. At high speeds, it shook so violently that test pilots could barely read their instruments. But in a time when propaganda mattered as much as performance, the truth was a dangerous thing. So the problems were buried under optimism, and the plane was declared a success before it had even proven it could fly. The first flight was supposed to be a triumph, a cinematic moment of national pride. The test pilot, an experienced veteran of the pre-war era, climbed into the cockpit with quiet dread. He had seen too many rushed machines in his lifetime, too many promises that turned into tombs. The engine sputtered to life, coughing smoke before catching rhythm. As the wheels left the ground, the fighter's flaws became instantly clear. The controls were heavy, the climb rate pathetic, and the wings trembled like leaves in the wind. The pilot later described it as trying to tame a beast that didn't know what it was. But reports had to be written carefully. The higher-ups didn't want the truth, they wanted reassurance. And so the notes were softened, the warnings ignored, and the aircraft was greenlit for mass production. Factories soon filled with the sound of drills and hammers. Young workers, many barely trained, toiled day and night assembling machines they believed would win the war. Posters promised victory through aviation. Radio broadcasts called the fighter a marvel of modern design. But the engineers at the top were filled with quiet dread. They knew what was being built, and they knew it wasn't ready for war. They begged for time to fix the flaws, to test new engines, to reinforce the frame. Time, however, was the one thing war never offered. When the first squadrons received their new fighters, excitement quickly turned to confusion. Pilots were shocked by how fragile the planes felt. The instruments rattled, the canopy leaked, the guns jammed. Even taxiing on rough airfields cracked the landing gear. One pilot joked bitterly that it could barely fight gravity, let alone the enemy. Flight instructors tried to stay optimistic. They called it a plane for the skilled, implying that its problems were a test of a pilot's ability rather than evidence of terrible design. But the truth was undeniable. The aircraft was fundamentally flawed. Its center of gravity was misplaced, making it unstable in even gentle turns. Its engine overheated within minutes of takeoff, belching smoke that obscured vision. At low speeds, it stalled violently without warning. And at high speeds, the wings twisted, threatening to tear away from the fuselage. It was a miracle of bad engineering, the product of political pressure rather than aeronautical science. Yet production continued. The war machine didn't care for second chances. As the first combat units prepared for deployment, many pilots privately voiced their concerns. Letters home described the aircraft as a coffin with wings, a punishment in aluminum, a mistake no one dares to admit. Some refused to fly it unless ordered. But orders always came. When the first dogfights arrived, the results were catastrophic. The enemy fighters tore through them with ease, faster, stronger, better armed. The new miracle fighter could barely stay in formation, let alone fight. Losses mounted, and morale collapsed. It became clear to everyone, from the pilots to the mechanics, that this aircraft had no place in the skies. Back at the factories, engineers worked frantically to make improvements. They strengthened the wings, replaced the engine, even redesigned the tail section. But every fix created new problems. The heavier frame slowed it further. The new engine consumed more fuel, reducing range. The modified controls jammed under stress. It was like trying to heal a dying man with bandages and hope. Even when the updated version was released, it was too little, too late. The enemy's technology had already advanced far beyond reach. The fighter that was supposed to defend the homeland now struggled to stay airborne during training. Mechanics stripped working parts from one plane to keep another. Flying. A grim cycle of cannibalization. Still, the propaganda continued. Newsreels showed the aircraft taking off gracefully, camera angles hiding its stumbles and shakes. Commentators spoke of the pride of the Air Force and the wings of victory. But on the front lines, pilots knew better. They watched their friends fall from the sky, their engines trailing smoke, their radios filled with desperate voices that went silent mid-sentence. Each new mission felt like a death sentence. One pilot reportedly whispered before takeoff, "If I come back, it won't be because of this plane." And many didn't come back at all. The public, unaware of the full truth, continued to cheer for their nation's air arm. Newspapers showed triumphant headlines of enemy bombers destroyed, while censor offices buried reports of entire squadrons lost in minutes. Behind the curtain of propaganda, officers began quietly grounding the aircraft, replacing it with anything they could find. Even outdated pre-war biplanes performed better. In some regions, the plane was reassigned to training duty, then to reconnaissance, then finally to oblivion. Its name became a joke whispered in mess halls, a curse among pilots, and a cautionary tale among engineers. Years later, after the war, one of its surviving designers confessed, "We built it to please the politicians, not the pilots." Those words encapsulated the entire tragedy of the machine. It wasn't just a failed aircraft, it was a symptom of how war corrupts innovation, how pressure destroys precision. In peacetime, it might have become something great. With time, testing, and refinement, its sleek lines might have found purpose. But war devours patience. What emerged was not a fighter, but a flawed dream forced into reality, a creation doomed the moment it left the drawing board. As the conflict dragged on, the few remaining examples of this aircraft sat quietly on the edges of airfields, stripped for parts, forgotten by the very men who once praised it. Their metal skins dulled by sun and rain, their cockpits gathering dust, their purpose erased. Children who played near the bases sometimes climbed into their empty shells, pretending to be heroes of the sky, not knowing they sat inside the husks of history's greatest disappointment. Decades later, a handful of them would be found in scrap yards or museums, their stories reduced to a footnote. Visitors would pass by, barely glancing at the display, unaware that behind that rusted fuselage lay a story of arrogance, desperation, and human failure. And yet, there is something deeply human about this tragedy. The engineers who built it were not villains, they were dreamers trapped by circumstance. The pilots who flew it were not fools, they were patriots with no other choice. Together, they represent the eternal tension between hope and hubris, between invention and desperation. The fighter was born from a belief that man could conquer the air through will alone. But the air is merciless. It exposes every flaw, every shortcut, every false promise. In its relentless honesty, the sky became the ultimate judge. When historians look back, they often celebrate the Spitfires, the Mustangs, the Messerschmitts, machines that defined mastery. But the story of this aircraft, the pathetic fighter that failed before it ever had a chance, tells another truth. It reveals the dark side of innovation, the cost of haste, the danger of pride, and the suffering of those forced to carry the weight of broken promises. In a war that demanded perfection, this machine offered only lessons. Lessons written not in textbooks, but in smoke, fire, and loss. It is said that the real tragedy of failure is not in the broken object, but in the shattered faith of those who believed. In it, for every aircraft that soared to glory, there were dozens that never left the ground with honor. And for this one, its legacy is not in victories or medals, but in the haunted silence of those who once placed their trust in it. The most pathetic fighter of World War II did not just fall from the sky, it fell from grace, dragging with it the hopes of the men who dreamed of flight. To climb into the cockpit of this aircraft was to step into a nightmare, a test of courage that few men could fully comprehend until the wheels left the ground. The moment the canopy sealed, the pilot was isolated, suspended in a fragile tube of metal and glass, with nothing but skill and hope between him and oblivion. The controls were heavy and unresponsive, as if the plane itself resented human command. Every movement of the stick required effort, every adjustment a negotiation with gravity and instability. The cockpit was cramped, instruments rattling under vibration, warning lights flickering erratically, and the engine's roar a constant reminder of how little margin for error remained. Even before takeoff, fear was tangible, a thick, choking companion that clung to the pilot's gloves and helmet. Once airborne, the machine's deficiencies were mercilessly exposed. Climb performance was abysmal. It could barely lift itself against the pull of the atmosphere, and any attempt to gain altitude quickly became a struggle. Enemy aircraft, lighter, faster, more agile, could slice through the sky effortlessly while this fighter strained and wheezed behind them. In combat, the plane's shortcomings became a death sentence. Turning radii were too wide, leaving it vulnerable in dogfights. Its sluggish acceleration meant that attempts to evade pursuing fighters were often futile. Even simple maneuvers, like a dive to gain speed or a bank to avoid flak, were fraught with danger. The aircraft quivered in panic under the pilot's hands, and the vibrations ran through the control column into his very bones. Many men recounted the sensation as if they were holding a wild animal, one that could lash out and end their lives with a single misstep. The guns, too, betrayed the pilot. Mounted awkwardly and prone to jamming, they were unreliable at the worst possible moments. Ammunition belts tore or misfed, and the synchronization with the propeller often failed, leaving the aircraft defenseless while under fire. Cannons recoiled violently, shaking the already unstable airframe. Pilots were forced to rely on skill alone, but even skill could not overcome the machine's fundamental flaws. Some recount missions where they could only watch as enemy fighters glided past, unable to respond effectively. Tracer rounds from opposing aircraft painted terrifying arcs across the sky, a deadly web that the pilot could not escape. Smoke trails from damaged engines and burning planes filled the horizon, a grim tapestry of failure that only intensified the weight of every decision. Fear became a constant companion, pressing against the helmet like a vice. Freezing was another cruel adversary. The cockpit offered little insulation, and at altitude, temperatures plunged to near impossible lows. Canopies would frost over, instruments iced up, and hands grew numb despite gloves. Pilots had to wrestle with both the machine and the cold, their reactions slowed, their focus split between survival and navigation. Communication with wingmen was often lost because the radio systems, underpowered and prone to failure, could not cope with the vibrations and electrical issues of the aircraft. Orders from command came through distorted, delayed, or not at all. This isolation magnified the terror. The pilot was alone, facing both the sky and the limitations of a machine designed by haste. Engine reliability was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Overheating was constant, smoke spilling from exhausts mid-flight, while vibrations threatened structural integrity. Pilots had to constantly monitor temperature gauges, oil pressure, and fuel levels, knowing that a single lapse could result in catastrophe. Some missions ended not because of enemy action but because the engine literally gave out mid-air. The roar would falter, the propeller slow, and the plane would plummet, leaving its occupant to pray for survival. Even when the engine held, its sluggish performance meant evasive maneuvers were nearly impossible. The pilot could not outrun, outclimb, or outturn a competent adversary. Victory was an illusion. Survival itself became the goal. And yet, despite every flaw, pilots flew. They endured missions in this defective cage of metal, clutching hope like a talisman. They reported to airfields that were as cold and unforgiving as the sky above, mechanics shaking their heads as they patched, bolted, and sometimes improvised solutions to keep the aircraft flying. Every sortie was an exercise in courage, a battle against both the enemy and the machine itself. Pilots recounted the terror of seeing tracers streak toward them, the heart-stopping moment when the engine coughed and lost power, the sickening lurch of the aircraft in a sharp turn. Their courage was constant, their skill extraordinary, but even the best could not fully counter the fundamental failings built into the plane. The enemy, for their part, often treated encounters with this fighter with a mixture of disdain and efficiency. Experienced pilots recognized it instantly: a slow, unwieldy target, a plane whose every limitation screamed vulnerability. Sometimes they took pity, giving a head start, a fleeting chance of escape. But mercy in the sky is rare. More often, these planes were obliterated in minutes, ripped apart by gunfire or forced down by mechanical failure. In debriefings, captured pilots described the humiliation of flying a machine so inadequate it could not meet the basic demands of aerial combat. They were not defeated by bravery, skill, or tactics, they were defeated by design. Yet in the chaos and terror, small acts of heroism emerged. Pilots learned to compensate for weaknesses, performing desperate maneuvers to buy a fraction of a second. They coordinated tightly with wingmen, relying on numbers and strategy to offset their aircraft's inferiority. Even in failure, they demonstrated ingenuity, courage, and endurance. It was a brutal education in the unforgiving laws of physics, of combat, of life and death in the air. Every mission written into memory was a testament to human perseverance, the human spirit battling against both circumstance and technology. The plane's reputation grew not through triumphs but through tragedy. Squadrons became synonymous with loss, with smoke-streaked skies and spiraling wrecks. Stories circulated of pilots who barely survived a single sortie, returning with frostbite, bruises, and a haunted gaze. Aircraft once hailed as national pride became jokes, whispered with bitterness in mess halls. Engineers who had rushed them to production could do little but watch as their creation, like Icarus, fell repeatedly from the heavens. Manuals were rewritten, procedures adjusted, tactics altered, but nothing could fully redeem the aircraft's shortcomings. Each flight was a battle against inevitability. Mechanics, too, were heroic in their own way. They stripped functioning parts from one plane to repair another, often working in freezing, muddy airfields under constant threat of attack. Every engine replacement, every patchwork repair was a gamble. Some pilots developed a grim trust in their ground crews, knowing that ingenuity and skill on the tarmac might be their only hope of surviving the next sortie. The symbiosis between man and machine became painfully apparent. The aircraft demanded both respect and fear, and survival relied on a relentless human effort that transcended design. The psychological toll on pilots was profound. Flying this fighter required not only technical skill but immense mental resilience. Each mission left scars invisible to the eye: anxiety, dread, and the gnawing awareness that death could arrive not from enemy action but from the aircraft's own inadequacy. Letters home were carefully crafted to conceal fear. Diaries recorded whispered confessions of terror. Friends mourned losses that could have been avoided if only the machine had been competent. These were men trained for aerial combat, yet they found themselves trapped in an unequal duel with physics and engineering mistakes. Every sortie became a story of tension, of desperation, of courage under impossible conditions. Pilots learned to anticipate failure, to expect engine sputters, gun jams, frozen canopies, and flailing controls. They became masters of improvisation, adjusting flight paths mid-air, compensating with skill that no machine could grant. Even when shot at, even when outnumbered, the pilot's survival relied as much on understanding his plane's limitations as on dodging enemy fire. In a world of metal, speed, and fire, the human mind became the ultimate weapon. And yet, tragedy was inescapable. Many missions ended with aircraft spiraling uncontrollably to the ground, the engine smoking, wings twisted, fuselage buckled. Parachutes opened too late, if at all. Survivors returned battered, frozen, and emotionally scarred, recounting the narrow escape from what should have been certain death. The plane was no longer a tool of war, it was a crucible of fear, a test of courage, a symbol of flawed ambition. Even heroism was tainted by the ever-present shadow of failure. By the time squadrons rotated back to base, the tally of lost aircraft and injured men had grown staggering. The fighter's legend, or rather, its infamy, spread among pilots, officers, and engineers alike. The word, pathetic, was whispered in corners, in hushed tones behind closed hangar doors, carried with grim recognition and dark humor. It became a symbol of what happens when ambition overtakes reason, when deadlines replace diligence, and when survival is left to chance. The enemy may have been deadly, but the real threat was the aircraft itself. In the end, this fighter stands as a testament to the duality of war, the courage of men juxtaposed against the cruelty of flawed machines. Pilots flew at knowing the odds, relying on skill, courage, and a touch of luck to survive. Each mission became a meditation on fear and endurance, a lesson in how fragile human life is in the sky. And though its victories were few, if they existed at all, the aircraft's story is far from meaningless. It immortalizes human resilience, the unbreakable determination to rise above a creation that was never meant to succeed. By the end of the war, the most pathetic fighter of World War II had faded into obscurity, a ghost of broken promises and failed ambition. The airfields that once echoed with the roar of its engines now lay quiet, abandoned runways cracked and overgrown with weeds, hangars hollow and echoing with the memories of frantic mechanics and terrified pilots. Each aircraft that had survived the conflict was slowly stripped for parts or left to rot under the relentless sun and rain. Where once there had been pride, there was now shame. Where there had been hope, there was only the rusting skeletons of metal, a testament to the cruel irony of human ambition gone astray. Pilots, mechanics, and engineers who had poured their lives into the aircraft had moved on, carrying the invisible scars of encounters that had tested the limits of endurance and sanity. The war had moved on, but the fighter's story remained a quiet, lingering tragedy, whispered in mess halls and workshops, its lessons learned too late for the men who had trusted it. It had begun as a symbol of hope, a machine that was supposed to protect nations and dominate the skies, but it quickly revealed itself to be the opposite, a harbinger of loss. Its very name became synonymous with failure, a reminder of the cost of rushing invention in a world already consumed by conflict. Officers and pilots spoke in hushed tones about its inadequacies, recounting missions where friends had been lost not to enemy fire but to structural failure, overheating engines, and weapons that jammed at the worst possible moments. It was a fighter that demanded courage simply to operate, where every sortie became a battle against the very machine itself. And yet, in the wreckage and humiliation, there remained a strange, haunting nobility. Pilots who flew it had been forced to develop extraordinary skill, ingenuity, and resilience. They had faced the ultimate test and survived against odds that no ordinary aircraft could impose. The machine may have been a failure, but the men who endured it became legends in their own right, the unsung heroes of a story that history was all too eager to forget. Mechanics and engineers, too, bore witness to the slow death of the fighter. For them, the aircraft had been an obsession, a relentless challenge, a puzzle that refused to be solved. They had scavenged broken parts from one plane to repair another, worked in freezing or scorching conditions to keep engines running, and improvised solutions that were never truly enough. Every repair was a gamble, a temporary reprieve from the inevitable, and yet they labored on, driven by duty, desperation, or simply the hope that one day their creation might finally fly as it was meant to. When the war ended, Many of these men quietly retired or moved to other projects, leaving behind the aircraft as a monument to frustration and failure. Some of the surviving planes were gathered for study, stripped down for analysis, but no lessons could fully redeem the thousands of lives risked and the countless missions that ended in smoke and fire. The fighter became, in the eyes of engineers and pilots alike, a bitter teacher of humility, a reminder that not every dream could withstand the harsh realities of war. Even as the war ended, the visual memory of the aircraft lingered like a scar across the imagination of those who had faced it. Airfields once teeming with activity now appeared desolate, empty cockpits staring up at gray skies, their instruments frozen in time. Photographs captured the planes lined up in formation, a deceptive semblance of order and power that belied their inadequacy in battle. Veterans recounted tales of trembling wings, sputtering engines, and frantic evasions, each memory painted in smoke, fear, and adrenaline. The world outside may have celebrated victory, but for those who had flown or maintained these machines, the end of the conflict brought little relief. They had faced death in the sky, often at the hands of the very aircraft that should have protected them, and that experience could never be erased. The most pathetic fighter of the war had left an indelible mark on those who survived, not one of glory, but of endurance, horror, and, strangely, respect for the human spirit in the face of relentless failure. The psychological toll of the fighter's failures was profound. Pilots who had flown it often spoke of nightmares, recurring visions of spinning fuselages, smoke-filled cockpits, and the frantic faces of comrades lost to the sky. Many carried a quiet trauma, an understanding that survival had been a delicate balance between skill and sheer luck. Even years later, the sound of an engine sputtering, or the sight of a propeller spinning idly, could transport a veteran back to the moments of terror and tension they had experienced. Training new generations of pilots. With other, more capable aircraft often involved cautionary tales of this fighter's inadequacies, embedding its lessons into the culture of the Air Force long after the last machine had rusted away. Its legacy, though tragic, became a touchstone for understanding the stakes of aerial combat, the thin line between life and death, and the relentless consequences of flawed design. For the historians who later chronicled the war, the fighter became a symbol of the pitfalls of wartime innovation. While some aircraft were celebrated as triumphs of engineering, courage, and design, this machine occupied the opposite end of the spectrum. It was studied as a case in what happens when ambition overrides practicality, when deadlines and political pressures outweigh careful engineering, and when human lives are entrusted to machines that cannot meet the demands placed upon them. Museums that later displayed surviving examples did so not to glorify, but to educate, to remind future generations that technology, no matter how promising on paper, is nothing without rigorous testing, patience, and respect for the laws of physics. In this sense, the fighter's failure transcended its immediate tragedy, offering a timeless lesson about hubris, haste, and human resilience. Yet, in its decay, the aircraft also possessed a haunting beauty. Rusted fuselages glinted in the sunlight, twisted wings created abstract patterns against the horizon, and broken cockpits framed empty skies. Photographers, artists, and writers were drawn to these remnants, capturing images of machines that had once inspired hope but delivered only despair. The planes stood as silent witnesses to the war, frozen in a state of liminality between purpose and failure, between heroism and hubris. They were monuments not to victory, but to the human experience of confronting the impossible, of striving against odds that were insurmountable, and of finding meaning even when the outcome was predetermined. Veterans who returned home often sought closure, revisiting airfields where the aircraft had been stationed or attending reunions of their former squadrons. Conversations were filled with both laughter and sorrow, laughter at the absurdities of trying to fight in a machine so ill-suited for combat, sorrow for the comrades lost and the missions that ended in flames. The fighter had shaped their lives indelibly, leaving a dual legacy of trauma and heroism. They spoke of it with reverence tempered by scorn, a complicated emotion that combined respect for survival with anger at the betrayal of expectation. It became a shared memory, a story passed down through generations, a cautionary tale etched into the collective consciousness of those who understood the price of failure in wartime aviation. The aircraft's ultimate fate was quiet and unceremonious. Scrapped, abandoned, or left to rot, the survivors slowly disappeared from the landscape. Airfields returned to farmland, hangars were demolished, and the few relics preserved in museums became dusty artifacts. But even in its absence, the story persisted. Books, documentaries, and oral histories kept the memory alive, ensuring that the lessons and tragedies were not forgotten. Pilots' descendants would hear stories of bravery against impossible odds, of machines that tested human endurance, and of the thin line between life and death in the skies. The fighter became more than a machine. It became a symbol, an enduring reminder that war is as much about human resilience as it is about technology. By reflecting on its failures, later generations of engineers, pilots, and historians could see the consequences of haste, pressure, and hubris. The aircraft was a teacher of hard truths, that courage alone cannot overcome poor design, that ambition must be tempered by rigor, and that human lives are invaluable in the calculus of war. While it never achieved fame in battle, it achieved a different kind of immortality, a story of endurance, tragedy, and the complex interplay between human effort and flawed machines. Its silence in abandoned airfields spoke louder than any roar of engines ever could. Even now, photographs of the aircraft, rusted and abandoned, evoke a sense of melancholy. The broken fuselages, the twisted wings, the empty cockpits, all frozen in time, remind us of the fragility of human endeavor, the unpredictability of war, and the courage required simply to face the sky in the face of near-certain failure. Veterans' memoirs recount the fear, the struggle, and the rare moments of triumph, painting a picture of endurance against insurmountable odds. And in these stories, the fighter lives on, not as a hero of battle, but as a monument to human perseverance, a testament to the courage of those who flew, maintained, and survived it against all odds. The most pathetic fighter of World War II did not fall in glory, it fell in obscurity, leaving behind only memories of the terror it imposed and the extraordinary resilience it inspired. Its story is not one of victory, but of endurance, a reminder that heroism is not only found in triumph, but in survival, in persistence, and in the human capacity to rise above flawed machines and impossible circumstances. And though it sits quietly in museums or disappears into history, its legacy remains vivid, etched into the memories of those who bore witness to its failures, and immortalized in the lessons it imparted to all who came after.